As probably almost none of you know, today is the release date of Force of Will in English. A friend of mine told me about this game about a year ago, and ever since then I've been trying to follow the news, and today is finally the day we get to see it in English. So today I'd like to talk to you about Force of Will, discuss why I think it's so interesting, and even teach you how to play the game so that you can get in on it as well. Most of the aspects of Force of Will are things that we've seen in other card games, but are combined in a really unique way here. The game uses life points like Yu-Gi-Oh! The monster system is very reminiscent of a mix between Duel Masters and Magic the Gathering. We've got almost a shieldish element like Duel Masters and Kaijudo, and we even play with like a commander of sorts like you would see in Vanguard. It's also got kind of like an evolution level up kind of thing like you would see in, well, oddly enough, the My Little Pony card game, but let's just stop talking about that. One of the things that really caught my eye about this card game is the first set that we're getting in English, or I should say the first two sets, because we're getting a 4-set block, is based on old fairy tales. I'm talking Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, that kind of thing. But they all seem to have kind of a unique twist on the old fairy tale to make the characters a little more interesting. For example, in this version of Snow White, the poisoned apple doesn't actually kill Snow White or put her into a coma or whatever was supposed to happen in Snow White. Instead, it actually turns her into a ravenous killer. The Queen's entire problem with Snow White in the first place was the fact that she was the fairest in the land, so that the Queen couldn't be the fairest. Well, now that she's a cold-blooded killer, she's not the fairest in the land anymore. This is a really interesting take on the fairy tale, and I think it's a really clever way to implement this kind of story into the card game. There's also this other take on Snow White, where when the prince finds Snow White's body, he doesn't think to kiss her, so he just assumes that she's dead. He takes her back to his castle and just remains forever in love with her corpse. How romantically creepy. There's this take on Red Riding Hood where the girl is actually a werewolf, so she's just regular Little Red Riding Hood by day, and then when the moon comes out at night, she turns into the wolf itself. Making Red and the wolf both the same character is pretty fascinating. There's a take on Cinderella where presumably she decides to hold on to the fairy godmother's powers, but in order to keep the powers up, she needs to seduce princes and steal their life forces. So she's not a hard worker who is abused and falls in love with the prince and lives in a castle. She actually let the power go to her head and just keeps it up by stealing the souls of men. It's a much darker take on the character, and the artwork isn't bad either. I'd love to go through all of these, but I'll make this my last example because I do want you guys to go out and do some research on this yourselves. I'm just hoping this entices you enough to do a Google search. This set includes a take on Romeo and Juliet, where Juliet is still kind of the sweet, innocent girl that she's always been, but when you get to Romeo, he's an immortal, so when they both kill themselves, he doesn't actually die. He's just gotta live off the rest of his life alone. If you go to the official site or the wiki, there are a lot more stories, so I hope you take a look, or even better, I hope you buy some cards. Currently, alongside the two sets that were released, you'll also find 5 starter decks. I went ahead and picked up a box that comes with all 5 for a very reasonable price. I think it was like $50 to $60. And I'm really looking forward to reviewing them for you. While none of the fairy tale characters are featured in any of the starter decks do look really cool and unique. The light deck seems to revolve around the Knights of the Round Table, the red deck has to deal with feudal-era Japan lore, the blue deck has to deal with sort of German-Greek lore, the green deck is, well, elves. What else do you do with green in a card game, I guess? And the black deck looks sort of like a take on Norse mythology, though I'll have to check myself on that one. Japan so far has also been treated to a few more sets, mainly based on the War of Valhalla, but they skipped that and went straight to the fairy tale theme for this one, so we'll either expect to see those in the next release after the Grimm block is over, or maybe we just won't get those at all and they'll skip them altogether. So we've been talking about the cards for a while. One thing that I really want to discuss is the artwork. For the most part, the cards look gorgeous. I'd say like 80 to 90% of the artwork is beautiful. Most of it's very creative. It's drawn very well. You can tell that people put a lot of time and effort into making these cards look like something that you would want to collect. I don't want this to come out the wrong way, but some of the artwork looks a little bit amateurish. Please don't understand me, alright? I'm not saying that it's bad. By no means is any of this artwork necessarily quote-unquote bad. But when you're comparing the artworks of all of the cards, first of all, you can definitely tell that they were all done by different artists. There were probably 4 or 5 different artists that put their artwork into this game. And I'd say that a couple of the artists sort of stand out for not having put as much work into their artwork as the others did. It's not bad, but it stands out as not looking quite up to par with the other cards. Really, there's just one more teensy tiny thing I want to bring up before we take a look at the rules. Typos. I didn't actually want to include any examples here, first of all because this is a learning video and I don't want you guys to be super distracted by all of the typos on the cards, and 2 because I want to do a separate video where I actually poke fun at some of the typos that they made. The weird thing is, none of the cards have any spelling errors per se, but they definitely sound like broken English when you read them out loud. Like, there are apostrophes missing, there are S's missing. It's really kind of a nightmare. I hope that not too many people notice, because I do think that this is a decent card game, and I don't want it to be ruined by something as tiny as that. And I know that they're not necessarily native English speakers, they're Japanese, so obviously their English isn't going to be perfect, but the translators they got did not do a good job of reviewing these cards and making sure they sounded good. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at the rule sheet. Here's the front side. This should give us our basics. First, we're going to look at the rulers. The basics of the ruler is they start on their basic ruler side. The game also refers to this as being face down. Being face up will mean they've gone onto their other side, their J ruler side. At the start of the game, your ruler will give you some basic abilities most of the time, and they'll also have some kind of flip activation effect. If you J activate them, they go from being a regular ruler to actually being a monster on your side of the field with special rules. We'll take a look at the 2 example cards they've given us. At bullet point 1, we've just got the name of the card, and at bullet point 3, it just tells us that it's the regular ruler. Rulers and J rulers don't need a mana cost because they start the game in play and you're only going to have one of them. Its first ability says J activate, and it's got 2 yellow symbols and a number 2. This means in order to flip this card over and have it become a monster, you have to give up 2 yellow will and 2 of any color. I'll explain more about will later, but if you've played any game involving mana, then it's pretty much the exact same thing. It has a continuous effect where all resonators targeted by an addition gain plus 200. I'll talk about additions later, but they're enchantments for anybody who's played Magic. And finally, it has an activate ability where you can rest it and give one resonator plus 400 until the end of turn. If we use its J activate ability, then it turns into Apollon, the god of light. Again, at bullet point 1 we have its name, and at 3 we have that it's a J ruler. The battling characters that you summon in this game are called resonators. So even though this is kind of like a resonator in that it can attack and defend because it's got attack points number 5 and defense points number 6, it isn't affected by effects that normally target resonators. This card has target attack, which is a special ability we'll talk about later. It has an enter effect where you destroy all race, demon, and dragon resonators on the field. Be careful how you play this, because it affects both sides of the field. This card also has a continuous ability, just like its other side, but this time it's your opponent reveals all cards in his or her chance standby area. Chance standbys are like trap cards. We'll get into them a little more later, but for right now, just think of them as trap cards from Yu-Gi-Oh! The J ruler also has a few other rules, but we'll get into that a little bit later. For right now, I just want you to familiarize yourself with the card. Next, we'll talk about Magic Stones. Magic Stones act like mana. They give you the necessary energy you need to activate abilities and play new cards. Looking back at Delphinius, you'll remember that his J activate ability needed 2 yellow and then 2 of any color. So to use that ability, we would need at least 2 of these light Magic Stones and then 2 more stones that can be anything. Unlike other card games, your Magic Stones get their own separate deck away from your main deck, so they don't clutter up your main deck with anything. You can put the top card of your Magic Stone deck in play on your side of the field by resting your ruler card during your main phase. Keep in mind that J-Rulers can do this too. Getting onto the main attraction, we'll look at Resonators next. Resonators are the actual creatures that you'll be summoning to your side of the field to do damage to your opponent. At 1, you'll see its name like normal. Now that we've gotten onto main deck cards, we can talk about bullet point 2, which is will point cost. You'll notice in the gray circle that one of the dots is lit up red. The circle also has a white number 2 next to it and a smaller circle. This means you have to rest one of your fire magic stones along with 2 of any color, in order to play this card from your hand. At bullet point 3, we'll notice that it's a Resonator with a Resonator type. In this case, it's Resonator Spirit. Some in-game effects will affect Resonators of one type, such as Appall in destroying all demons and dragons. Because this isn't a demon or a dragon, it wouldn't be destroyed by the effect. At bullet point 4, you'll notice that this Resonator has an activate ability. You can pay 2 will to give this card plus 200 plus 0 until the end of turn. Most activate abilities can be activated pretty much at any time, so you can even do this during your opponent's turn if you really want to. At 5 and 6, we have the attack and defense of the card. Spells will probably be the most common card you play other than Resonators. At 1 and 2, you have the name and mana cost. At 3, you have that it's a spell, chant, instant, meaning it can be played during either player's turn. And at 4, you have the effect of the card. In this case, this card returns 1 Resonator to its owner's hand. In addition to instants, there are also spell chant standbys, which come into play face down and then trigger when some kind of field effect happens. The last thing we'll look at are addition cards. Additions are permanent effects that either come into play onto the field or come in on a Resonator. At 1 and 2, you have the name and the mana cost. At 3, you'll see that this is an addition that targets a Resonator. And at 4, you'll get its effect. As long as this card is in play, the Resonator it's attached to gains flying. Next, we'll look at the field setup. It can look a little bit cluttered, a little bit intimidating at first, but it's really not so bad. Your ruler rightfully goes in the center, near the bottom. Your face-down standby cards go to your right, and your magic stones go to your left. Above your magic stone area, you have a life break area. More on that later. Above your life break area, you have a magic stone deck, which is where you keep your magic stones. Above the standby area, you have your discard pile and your main deck. Overall, it's pretty simple. All of your characters go to the middle in the field. This includes Resonators and J-Rulers. A written explanation of all of the field setup is down here. We won't really go over it because we already kinda did go over, and it's really just repeating everything that I already said. This side will discuss some of the actual gameplay. At the beginning of the game, you and your opponent shuffle both your Magic Stone deck and your main deck and you put them in their appropriate areas. Then decide who goes first. After that, draw 5 cards. If there are any cards in your hand that you don't want, put them on the bottom of your deck in any order and draw the same number of cards. Once both you and your opponent are happy with your hands, take the top 4 cards of your deck and put them on the life break zone. Finally, reveal who your ruler is and put him in play. The victory conditions are pretty standard. Each player has 4,000 life points and the first one to 0 loses. You also lose if you need to draw or discard any cards from your main deck and there aren't any available. This section explains deck building. Your deck has to have at least 40 cards and none of them can be magic stones. Your magic stone deck can have 10 to 20 cards and they can only be magic stones. Neither deck may include more than 4 copies of any one card. The only exception to this are non-special magic stone cards. That just means regular fire, magic stone, light magic stone, so on and so forth. At the beginning of your turn, you draw 1 card. The player who goes first doesn't do this on their first turn. Unlike other card games, you recover your rested cards after you've drawn your card for the turn. Moving on to your main phase, you can do any of these 9 things in any order anytime you want to. The first is resting your ruler or J-Ruler to get 1 card from your Magic Stone onto your Magic Stone area. Some rulers can also rest themselves for other abilities, so you have to decide if you want to do that or get a Magic Stone. You can summon Resonators by paying their mana cost, although keep in mind the first turn they come into play they cannot attack. In addition to not attacking, they also can't use any ability that would rest them. If the Resonator has an ability that they can use that doesn't cause them to rest, then they can go ahead and use it. Resonators can be rested through other effects, they just can't rest themselves to attack or use one of their own effects. You can play spells and additions as well. If you have a spell chance standby, you can pay 2 of any color wills to put it face down in your standby area. Every standby spell has some kind of trigger effect. Look for what effect triggers it and then flip it whenever it's necessary, but not on the turn it was played, more on that later. You can activate abilities, declare that you want to start a battle phase, or turn your ruler into a J ruler. One of the unique things about Force of Will is you can have as many battle phases as you want to, and they're all considered separate phases. Whenever you're done with a battle phase, you go back into your main phase. To attack, choose your J ruler or one of your resonators, rest them, and then declare a target. To make sure we're all on the same page, I want to reiterate that you cannot do this with a resonator that you've summoned this turn or a J ruler that you summoned this turn. The 2 attack targets you have are your opponent directly to deal life point damage or one of your opponent's rested resonators. Yes, you can only attack a resonator to attempt to kill it if that resonator is already rested. So to keep your resonator safe, you can choose not to attack with them so that they can't become attack targets. Once you've selected your target, your opponent can decide whether or not they want to block. If they do decide to block, they can take one of their resonators that's recovered and rest it in order to block the attack. This can be done to block other resonators or block attacks to the player directly. If the defending player decides not to block, then the attack either hits the player directly or hits the resonator directly, depending on whether or not your target was the player or a resonator. Resolving battles is pretty simple. Each monster loses defense points equal to the amount of attack points to the monster they're battling. If the defense points go down to 0 during your turn, then that resonator is sent to the discard pile. I say during the turn because there are other effects that can cause a monster to lose defense points. If a monster has lost all of its defense points at any point, it's sent to the discard pile. I'd also like to point out that this is one of the examples of them not proof testing their stuff, because attack 200, defense 200, attack 200, defense 200 is not correct. It's actually 400, 200, 400, 400. In a case like this, even though the 400-200 is technically weaker than the 400-400, they both deal enough damage to each other's defense points to completely kill them. When a player has nothing else they want to do during their main phase, and no more battle phases they wish to initiate, they can end their turn. Damage taken by all J rulers and resonators are immediately healed and go back up to full. If you end your turn with 8 or more cards in your hand, you have to discard down until you have 7. 7 is the maximum hand size. Any will that you got during your turn and you didn't spend is now gone. Let's get on to the special rules about J rulers I was talking about earlier. First of all, we already know how to become a J ruler. You pay the J conditions and you flip the card over. However, some very interesting things happen when your J ruler has 0 defense points left, either by being defeated in battle or just taking enough damage to exceed its defense. The J ruler is flipped back over to its regular ruler side and put back into the ruler area. The ruler now has no abilities. It can only rest itself to bring up 1 magic stone, and really doesn't have very much use. There is one particular card that gets around this, a certain Dracula Alucard card. But that's only because the card has a special ability. In most cases, your ruler is now a blank card that gives you magic stones. Also, it doesn't seem to be written here, but once your ruler is defeated as a J ruler, then you lose half of the life points you had at that point. So for example, if your J ruler is defeated in battle and you have 2,000 life points, then you go down to 1,000 life points because the 1,000 is half of 2,000. We're actually going to talk about the life break area, which is something we've been ignoring up till now. You have 4 cards, each one represents 1,000 of your life points. At any time that you could normally activate abilities, you can flip over 1 card from your life break area depending on how much life you have. If you have between 4,000 and 3,100, you can only flip the first card. 3,000, 2,100, up to the first 2 cards, so on and so forth. There's no limit or timing on these. You could wait until you have like 500 life points left and flip all 4 at once if you wanted to. You cannot flip these cards in response to you losing enough life to go down to that amount of life points. So for example, if you have 3,500 and you're taking 1,000 points worth of damage, you can't flip it before you've actually taken the 1,000 points to stop yourself from taking the 1,000 points. When you flip over a card from your life break area, look and see if it has red text with the word break. If it does, do whatever it says in that red text and then discard the card. If the card has no red text, then the card does nothing. Just send it to the discard pile like usual. You just have to be lucky enough to get break cards in your life break area. It is completely possible to not have a single break card in your life break, but every once in a while it will turn the tide of a game. This explains a little bit more about how spell chant standbys work. One unique thing about spell chant standbys is you don't actually have to pay will for them. You only have to have enough magic stones to cover their will cost. This sounds a little confusing, but just think of it this way. Paying the 2 wills to put it in play is you paying its will cost, and in order to flip it, you just need to have enough will stones in play to cover that cost without actually having to pay for it. Trust me, you'll get it after a few games. The last thing we'll talk about is the chase system. The chase system is exactly like the stacking system we've seen in a lot of other card games. For people who are new to card games, I'll explain. The first person uses an ability. The second player either plays a card or uses an ability in response to that, and then the first player can choose whether or not to do something in response to that. The effects create kind of like a chain, and when both players are done adding effects to the chain goes off from the very last card played to the very first card played. So for example, let's say you and I are dueling and you activate an effect. We'll call this effect 1. And then I decide to play a card in response to it. We'll call that effect 2. And then you decide to do something in response to that. We'll call that effect 3. Well, once both of us are done, effect 3 goes off, then effect 2 goes off, then effect 1 goes off. If you're still having a little trouble understanding, trust me, it gets a lot easier when you actually start picking up the game and playing. In addition to the rule sheets, they also released a manga on the official site. I'll put a link to this manga in the description below. It's pretty entertaining, and if you're interested in the video that I've made or the card game itself, then I recommend just giving it a quick flip through. It won't take that long to read, maybe like 10 minutes or so, and it should give you a little more insight on the game. So what do I think of Force of Will? Well, overall as a card game, it has impressed me. Keep in mind that I haven't actually gotten my hands on the cards yet, they're still in the mail, so I haven't played the game myself yet, but when I do I'll give you an update on that as well. But just from what I've read, everything looks really solid. Force of Will isn't exploring any new grounds whatsoever. There's nothing revolutionary, there's nothing groundbreaking, but everything that it does do very decently. I feel like the game is very balanced and very fun to play. At the same time though, I'm a little afraid of just how many things that we've already seen in other card games. The game feels very much like a mishmash of different things from different card games we've all already played. This isn't necessarily a bad thing because that makes it a little easier to understand. It widens the demographic to a bunch of different people because they can recognize things from card games that they already love. But at the same time, it's just not giving us anything new. Like, I feel like Vanguard gave us a new idea and treated card games in a new way. I feel like Pokemon was unique, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic, Zatchbell, Naruto. I can name a bunch of different card games off the top of my head that are super unique and super fun to play. This isn't necessarily unique, and I feel like that's going to hurt it a little bit. Another thing I'm worried about is commercialism. This card game is so under wraps, I don't even know that many people who even know that today is the release date. This really terrifies me because when a card game's coming out, you want to hype it. You want to get people pre-ordering those decks, those booster boxes. You want to start getting people to play. I haven't heard of any tournaments happening for this. I haven't heard of any good press coverage, any magazine articles. Maybe they're out there, but I just haven't seen them, and that's not a good sign. I want all of you to go out there and play this game, and I want all of us to have a super good time, but at the same time, I do have to say, I don't think you should pick up anything related to this game within the first month that it's out. It hurts me to say that. I don't want to tell you guys to not buy these cards until a month after they're released, but it's my honest to God feeling that this game needs to get itself out there a little more, and we need to find out if this is a card that can survive. So unless you're a reviewer or just super insane like I am, I don't recommend actually picking this card game up until about a month or so has passed and we get to see how big they're planning on making this thing, unless you already know some other people who are for sure getting into the card game. This is a pretty fun card game, so get into it with your friends, but if you're just buying it by yourself hoping that it'll get big, give it a month, guys. Don't go out there and rush to buy this as soon as possible. As for the future of this card game on my channel, I am going to do a booster box opening pretty soon when the cards come in, probably on Tuesday. I plan on reviewing each of the starter decks because I'm actually going to own them in person this time. And if this video gets pretty good hype, then maybe I'll do some deck profiles. In the meantime, be sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video. Those things really do help me out. Leave your thoughts on the game in the comments section below. And finally, subscribe to stay up to date on the latest Kudou news. Until next time, game fans, enjoy your card games, nerds.